Hello, everybody. Earlier this week, my old friend Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Prize for Peace a couple of years ago, made a speech at the United Nations celebrating its 80th session, talking about the dangers of AI. She, with some other Nobel laureates, 200 of them, in fact, urgently called for international red lines to prevent unacceptable AI risks. A few weeks ago, we had Geoffrey Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize last year for physics, the godfather of AI, on the show, talking about the dangers of AI. Wonder whether he was a signatory. I'm sure he was. Many people have been warning about the dangers of AI for a while, including Maria and Geoffrey Hinton, and somebody else who warned quite a few years ago was my guest back in February of 2022. Jacob Ward, back then, a very distinguished journalist, writer on technology, had a new book out. It was back then called, it still is, The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. He wrote it, I think, just before ChatGPT 3 came out, or certainly before ChatGPT became a huge story. And I thought it'd be good to have Jacob back on the show 3.5 years later, to talk about AI and his thinking. Jacob, congratulations on The Loop. In retrospect, you really did get it right. The book, as your website that suggested, that predicted our AI moment. I'm not sure it was the only book, but certainly one of the more prescient ones. What did you get wrong in The Loop? Looking back at it, if you were writing it again, what would you have said that you didn't say?
Oh, I so appreciate that question. And Andrew, thank you so much for having me back. So yeah, I think that at that time, you know, when you and I talked those many years ago, you know, the thinnest part of that book was, which you immediately intuited, was the second part of the promise in the subline, which is how to fight back, right? The how AI is creating a world without choices. I feel like I got that pretty right. I was, you know, I had a couple people, you know, a couple reviewers say that this was a sort of speculative concept, but if anything, I wish I'd been more speculative about how fast and how complete.
Yeah, and our local newspaper, you're in Oakland, I'm in San Francisco, our local newspaper back in 2022, in January 2022, the headline was "Tech Writers' Stark Warning of How AI is Stripping Our Ability to Make Decisions." That was back in the San Francisco Chronicle back then. So a lot of journalists observed or certainly noted your warnings.
Yeah, they, you know, the problem at the time, I mean, I was a little bit of a victim of timing. And then I want to get to the thing that I really think I got sort of wrong or wish I'd put more into. I was like 10 months before ChatGPT. And so at that time, when we put out the hardcover, the first hardcover came out and we didn't put the word AI on the front. I wanted it to be on there, but we made it how technology is creating a world without choices and how to fight back, because we didn't think people would know what AI was, right? That's sort of the moment we were at. And I remember in the many appearances I made, yours was not one of them, but in many of them, I had to explain what AI was. Here's what it does. Here's how it works. You know, that these transformer models and so forth, like I had to sort of walk people through that. So I was a little bit, you know, it's in a way you can pat yourself on the back and be like, oh, I was early on that. On the other hand, boy, to then watch my thesis come to life was really hard and disappointing. And that leads me to my disappointment about the second part of it, which is how to fight back. And I'm not sure that I have any more of a built remedy for the situation we are in than I did in the book. But I wish I had fleshed out the one that I had, which was, there does seem to be, and I think Europe would have been the place to go and spend more time thinking with people about how they would get out in front of this, because they're as close to what I was talking about in the book as we've gotten. And, you know, basically the closest I came in the book was the handful of law firms that were beginning to win big settlements against what courts were increasingly seeing as manipulative and predatory marketing of things like very addictive gambling games to people. And you know, as close as we've come in this country to fighting back in this sense is the occasional lawsuit being settled out of court for huge amounts of money, right? We have yet to see a national regulatory action. We still don't have any digital privacy laws in this country except for kids under the age of 13. So I wish I had put more time into being speculative about what we should do about it. I was just so sort of focused on trying to warn people that this thing was coming. I don't think I wish I'd been more about that. And I remember you took me to task for that in this. You described mine as a failure to think about that stuff. And I think
Well,
you're right.
I'm not sure I used the F word.
Oh, brother, you did. I'm just
did?
looking.
Wow.
I've got it right here. You said
I'm brutal. I
what's-
wrote a book.
what's
I'm not
brutal-
sure if you remember, back in 2017, called "How to Fix the Future,"
Yes.
where I talked about it didn't talk about AI, but talked about the dangers of big tech and the promise of regulation. The one thing that comes to mind, rethinking your book, The Loop, you argue that the real danger isn't that some robot's going to enslave us. It's our own brain. Our brains are constantly making decisions using shortcuts, biases, and hidden processes. So what makes you confident, Jacob, that your brain is somehow above the rest of the brains, that you get it, but the danger is to everybody else that they're going to fall under the spell of this thing?
It's an excellent question. And I would say to you, the reason I feel qualified to warn people about this is that my brain is, if anything, I would say on the weaker end of this stuff. I am so susceptible to this kind of stuff. I've spent a good chunk of a day today when I should have been prospecting for leads on the stories I'm writing, scrolling TikTok. I mean, I am, I had to.
Well, it's quite productive. You've got 122,000 followers on TikTok.
Yeah, I do okay on TikTok. But it's funny because it's one of the, I've forever longed to somehow be a bartender who doesn't drink, because I want to be able to post and interact without having to actually have the frickin' app on my phone, because I'm so terrible at it. My addictive tendencies are so strong. I had to quit drinking in 2016. My ability to my wife's out of town right now for a few days, and I inevitably wind up staying up till 2 a.m. because I can't control myself.
I thought you were going to talk about some of your extracurricular.
Yeah, no, thank God I don't go that deep. But I am, I look, this is the thing that I try to do in the book, and that I try to do in this moment, is not blame people for their inability to resist this stuff, because I think it is absolutely everybody's circuitry to be vulnerable to the idea that we want to outsource our decision making to this stuff. That if you come along with a fancy looking, teletype system that will write your wedding vows for you, you are undoubtedly going to wind up using it. This is just how we are wired. We are not built to think things through every time. We're built to take cognitive shortcuts. That's what, all of the behavioral science has shown in the last 50 years. And so I don't consider myself, smarter or better than anybody else. I just happened to be in this moment at the time where I was doing a huge amount of reporting around behavioral science for a PBS show, and then doing a bunch of reporting around tech.
Right. So in other words, you're a bartender with a history of
Yeah,
you're all too familiar with the bottle. And as you say, you have a remarkable career. You've been on television, Popular Science. You were editor of Popular Science.
Yeah.
Now you have a very popular podcast. So you know this stuff. And I have to note, Jacob, for people who are just listening, you have a wonderful image of a man walking on the moon behind you.
Yeah.
Well, what's the point of that? Is that a reminder that of our genius in technological terms? Is it a warning?
It's funny. I choose these backgrounds depending on the conversation I have and depending on the mood I'm in. So sometimes I have one that's literally just like a ball of flame, right? If I'm in a raging kind of ranting mood. Today, because I think I have felt like loneliness in this otherwise miraculous technological environment is kind of the intellectual theme I'm pursuing right now. I just feel like there is a real feeling on a lot of people's parts that we have been isolated in some way by the moment we are in, and there are these seemingly sort of inexorable, irresistible forces that make us, our individual efforts seem so small and pointless. And so there's something unconscious, I think, in there about that.
Maybe it's because the man on the moon is on his own, doesn't have any friends.
Yeah, that's right. He's there's nobody coming to help him. And there's something about, I think there's really this moment right now where, we're starting to see, especially at the biggest companies, one of the theses that I pursued in this book was that the incentive structure of big companies was just going to be to pursue AI wherever it leads and use it wherever they possibly could to cut out labor costs and to go forward. And for several years, a couple of years anyway, right after the book came out, people that I would speak to inside these big companies were like, no. This is about improving the work of the workers we have and freeing up some time so they can do better and more creative work.
A Sam Altman take, in a sense.
A Sam Altman take. And now we are really starting to openly see companies, there was a big bank in Singapore, for instance, that said, we're going to fire a lot of people. You've got the head of Salesforce saying, we're not going to hire any more of this category of person. Like, we are really starting to see, I think, knowledge work, replaced, or at least the ambition to replace it at an industrial scale in a way that I wish I had been wrong about.
My wife, I may have mentioned this last time we talked, is a very senior person at Google. And last week, she had another unnamed, very senior person at Google over, and we were talking about kids and education. And this guy said, and he's seeing it from up above, he said, maybe not my daughter's generation who's just going to college, but their kids, there isn't going to be college, or there certainly be fundamentally changed college. And the idea of being educated for work will become a misnomer. So you may well be right. Jacob, so you were very generous to acknowledge that it wasn't a perfect book, and those are always the best books, the ones that are imperfect. What do you make of the last 3 years, since February, 3.5 years, since we talked? We've had, as you know, the explosion of ChatGPT, of generative AI, of Anthropic, of Gemini, of XAI. What's your headline on the last 3.5 years of the history of AI?
Yeah. Well, I think my headline overall is we will do whatever the market rewards is really what we have learned, right? That there was a lot of, when I was first thinking about this stuff, there were a lot of people sort of talking in this kind of, ethical, philosophical way about what the implications of AI might be. And I know many of your guests have had these very sort of high-minded ideas about what it might be, and and trying to sort out for themselves these sort of ethical problems. There was an early researcher connected to OpenAI who's now gone on elsewhere and was telling me about how there was a group of researchers all discussing something that they called the heroin problem. When
was that Ilya?
I can't name them, but this person basically said, we have looked at this and said, okay, if we're going to make the perfect AI personal assistant and you are addicted to heroin, what is it supposed to do? Is it supposed to get you off of heroin, or is it supposed to facilitate your addiction? And people were kind of working out, thinking about these problems that they realized AI was going to bring up. Now we're in this world where it is kind of boastful and marketing speak to talk about how scary and complicated the ethical questions are, right? You hear Sam Altman and others say, yeah, pretty crazy, boy, I don't know what we're going to do about that, as a kind of marketing ploy. And then at the same time, you have, Sam Altman said a few months ago that he and a group of his tech founder friends have a bet going about when we're going to see the first billion-dollar company run by a single person. And to my mind, I just think, wow, we have gone from this pretense once upon a time that the tech industry was going to sort of be the conscience and the intellect of society, to a world in which people are like placing wagers on when it is that nobody but a handful of people get to work, And to my mind, we have shifted. We are following the market in a way, the market will reward in a way that I've been very discouraged by.
Jacob, in a couple of weeks, I'm giving a speech actually in Amsterdam about whether or not we should trust AI. In fact, the name of the speech is, "Can Big Tech be trusted to design our agentic future?" You've always been rather suspicious of Big Tech. Are you more suspicious today in September 2025 as you were in February of 2022?
I would say I am definitely more suspicious, or maybe just as suspicious, but it's harder and harder to talk me out of it. I mean, I see the ways in which we have some of the smartest people, one of the big fashions right now in tech and tech hiring is military contracts and government contracts. And once upon a time, there was a sort of general sort of allergy in the tech world for, making surveillance programs, for military purposes, or making anything that could be used for an offensive, killing capacity, any of that stuff. Suddenly it's cool. It's perfectly cool to do that. And so for me, when I look at something like, in our agentic future, I can see amazing possible uses for that in something like, this is the argument that I keep making in the book, is like, there are lots and lots of fantastic uses for this stuff. You could use agentic, capabilities to, match people who are living without shelter with the services they need, and book them the hotel room for that night, book them the long-term transitional care they need, book them the detox facility, but no one's making money off of that. Instead, the idea that we're going to get into the fastest revenue maker we can, which is something like an agentic system that, feeds a surveillance platform for Palantir for the, in contract to the DoD. That's the stuff that I just think, what is clear is this industry is, for the most part, not everybody, but for the most part, led by a lot of people who are happy to attend a Trump banquet and flatter him with praise, and in order to get their way. There aren't, I think, as many principles on display as we once saw, at least in the sort of marketing of who these people were going to be.
Should we, Jacob, be encouraged by some of the principles being demonstrated? Anthropic comes to mind, for example. Certainly their marketing suggests that they're different in their response to, firstly, the existential dangers of AI, but also the Trump regime. Should we call these people out? You talked about resistance. Are they where the resistance begins, within the AI community, even within AI, within big tech? Anthropic, I use Claude, I like it. Seems a fairly reliable, coherent product.
Good product. That's right.
Should we admire Amadei and what he's doing at Anthropic?
I think that the founding principles of that company were very promising, right? There's a lot of this idea of we're going to incorporate, constitutional doctrine from these various founding documents and the Magna Carta and the human rights and the rest of it. They had a lot of things baked into the sort of the moral DNA of that company that I like a lot. On the other hand, we have seen, Amadei saying, that they need to make revenue, and that this is the thing, right? Any company doing these big foundational models has so much money to make back.
Yeah, and the money is just, is that absurd. Something that's, it certainly shocked me, not in a moral sense, just in day-to-day economic terms, the numbers involved, the tens, hundreds of billions now that these companies not only are being valued at, but the requirement to feed their need to work.
That's right. The capital expenditures for the AI industry, right? The tubes and the data centers and the servers accounted for 1/3 of the growth in GDP between last year and this year. We just saw NVIDIA is going to put $100 billion into OpenAI. I remember being blown away when 10 billion is what Microsoft was talking about investing in that company. Now we're at $100 billion of investment. So yeah, the money being spent, and to my mind, your principles will go so far, but once you owe your investors and or your shareholders or whoever it is for that incredible amount of money being spent, I think that your principles can get pretty squishy pretty quick. And so, the very few people that I see actually acting in a sort of form of resistance are the people who are trying to stymie the flow of the training data. So when I see, this is not, the person that I think about as a true sort of like fighting back against this is Meredith Whittaker, the president of Signal, the anonymous messaging app.
Yeah.
Her whole system, the whole point of that app is to make it such that your communications can't be handed over as training data. Like, that is her main focus right now. It starves her company of a huge revenue opportunity, I'm sure. And I think that it is you have to really make a sacrifice to make that kind of decision. And while I hear a lot of good rhetoric out of Anthropic, they are considered the most ethical of the companies. I think that they just owe an incredible amount of money, and they're going to have to make that money back. And I'll be curious to see what their principals do at that point.
And it also brings new meaning to the title of your book, The Loop, because it is, I don't know if it's a doom loop, but it's an insane loop where if indeed NVIDIA is investing whatever it is, 100 billion in OpenAI, they create their own markets. And at what point, if at all, does this thing break? Then we do really have a profound crash, not just of the ecosystem of AI, but maybe of a broader economy, given that big tech is actually driving Wall Street. Now, how fearful are you that all this is a loop, a way in which all of these companies are feeding themselves, investing massive amounts of money, whether it's the billions Microsoft put into OpenAI, or the money NVIDIA put into OpenAI, or the money OpenAI is putting into other AI startups? It's all part of this same bizarre loop that seems to represent the classic characteristics in the long term of a crash.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so from a pure dollars and cents perspective, I worry a great deal about the centralization of, the handful of pillars that the American economy is increasingly resting on, right? And if one of them is going to be this one, and we still have, and it's still a product in which you can't tell if the thing's telling the truth or not. And, I mean, you look at NVIDIA, right? What is it worth? $4 trillion right now, right? If let's say
depends when we're talking, sometimes 4 trillion, sometimes 5, sometimes 3.
Right, exactly.
What difference does a trillion make between friends?
Well, this is the thing, is that it might not make the difference between one company and another, but it'll make an enormous difference if that is wiped out.
Yeah, and I'm joking, of course, because
that's right.
a trillion or a couple of $1 trillion can actually change.
And would drag all these other parts of the economy would be dragged down by that. So there's that part of it. But then I also think, I mean, the thing that I really am worried about is, you mentioned your dinner guest, talking about
who will remain nameless, of course.
Who will remain nameless, who can, saying that in 2 generations, kids won't need to be educated in the same way. I think the problem that I worry about, this is a new thing that I've noticed just in the last year or so. The thing that I worry about is that we're going to have this, that this product was built and its uses have been envisioned by a group of people who had all the benefits of a great education, in that they learned critical thinking skills early, they learned to look at primary sources, they learned to think in a mathematical way about a problem. There are some fundamental educational milestones that those people passed. And armed with that education, I think those people are in fact poised to make fantastic use of AI, depending on what they do with it, of course, but there could be fantastic uses put to it. But if you cut to 2 generations from now, and you've got a generation of kids who've, I was just talking to somebody the other day who teaches a critical reading seminar at Berkeley for introductory undergrads, for first-year freshmen. And he said that his number one problem right now is convincing these kids that there is a difference between having read the book and having read a ChatGPT summary of that book. And to my mind, in 2 generations, if you've got kids who do not know how to interact deeply with a primary source using this scrim of, this summary machine all the time, I don't even know what the human brain is going to be for on the market anymore. If that truly feels to me like the end of knowledge work and critical thinking in a way that I am really worried about. And I think that could come upon us very, very quickly.
One of the other guests we've had on the show, and another Oakland resident, actually, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, Adam Becker. He had a book out earlier this year called More Everything Forever, AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity. And similar lines to yours. He had an interesting piece out recently in The Atlantic, talking about the useful idiots of AI doomsaying, the idea that AGI is just around the corner and that we humans are going to be replaced, become footnotes or enslaved to smart machines. What do you make of Becker's skepticism about AGI? I mean, we've had Gary Marcus on the show many times, an old friend of mine who is very skeptical of the idea of AGI. Sometimes Sam Altman, he seems to blow hot and cold on AGI. Sometimes he suggests it's around the corner. Sometimes he suggests it's a figment of somebody else's imagination. What do you make of that fear of AGI?
Well, my thesis back then, and it remains, is that I'm much more worried about, I'm not as worried about Terminator, and I'm much more worried about Idiocracy, right? The Mike Judge movie in which everyone's too stupid to function, basically. And, that
wonderful film.
Hilarious, but not as funny as it was, I will say. I watch it now, and that movie is darker than I remember.
It's like being there, right?
I'm like,
funny,
no.
But then when it becomes real, it becomes less funny.
It's less funny, exactly. It hits pretty close to home these days. And there's like Black Mirror. I can't watch that show because it's just like right between the eyes for me. I do not find that show relaxing. So I think Becker is on to something, especially because I'm sure Gary Marcus has told you, a lot of the people who are close to the actual technology of this stuff will tell you that the LLM generative AI moment we are in is not part of the pathway to AGI. That it is not.
He sees it as a cul-de-sac. We had Jeffrey Hinton on the show, who, when I asked him about AGI, or when I asked him about the existential dangers, he said 10 to 15%. And then I said, why? He said, because we have no idea.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think that the current architecture of these products doesn't lead us in that direction. That is what I keep being told by people smarter and more technical than I am. But I also think that, there has been this weird, part of what I like about Becker's thesis there is that there is also a co-opting of the doomsayer thing by the heads of these companies to make their product seem more important and impactful. It's I can't remember the last time you had, you never had the Henry Ford never talked about, how potentially dangerous the automobile would be, or that it might transform the world for the better, but it might be for the worse.
For the world jury, I think. He was with the dangers of Jews. So
yeah, that's right.
He had other things on his mind.
That's exactly right. But it wasn't part of his marketing plan to talk about the dangers of his vehicle. And now we have this weird corporate marketing speak in which you co-opt the dangers by making them almost a selling point. Like, lots of people are going to lose their jobs, is what Sam Altman has said, and he said, but the idea is that on the other side of that difficult transition, there will be this utopia that we can all reach. There's this faith-based thing in there that reminds me of the kinds of heaven and hell talk that you get out of spiritual leaders sometimes. And so to my mind, there is something. I am also not, at least in the short term, as worried about something like AGI. I have gotten really to a place where I consider that marketing speak, and I am much more concerned about the idea that nobody, that people are not going to be able to find work in a couple of years.
Yeah, and I think you're right to describe this bifurcated mentality, what Christians called Manichaeanism. Yeah. I mean, you see it in individuals and you see it in companies. In individuals, you see it, I think, most of all, obviously in Sam Altman, but particularly in Elon Musk, who, depending how he wakes up, seems to either be saying that AI is going to save the world or destroy it. He was the co-founder with Altman of OpenAI. And then, of course, the Manichaeanism is most evident within the company OpenAI, which has this weird profit, non-profit structure, which seems to want to have its economic and moral cake at the same time. What do you make of this weird Manichaeanism, both within individuals and within companies when it comes to AI?
Well, I do think that the companies are still stuck in a mode in which, for the most part, you do need to have you need to be able to convince young people that they're going to be doing something impactful and to some extent, morally redeeming. That is, it used to be that you really couldn't hire anybody out of business school or a CS program unless you could convince them they were going to improve the world. And every company had an administrative layer whose whole purpose was to go to convince people every day that their work counted toward making a better world. And so I think that runs very deep still in these companies. And so it is, I think, so there's that. There is also, however, a fashion right now around sort of giving what people consider a kind of authentic or honest take on the dangers of the thing we are making. That is, on the one hand, feels like it's sort of, from a marketing perspective, looks like sort of clear-eyed and is part of why these companies get invited into, congressional testimony and behind closed doors dinners with senators to educate them about, the possible regulations. There's something about that I think serves those purposes. But I also think that the ability to talk about that sort of scary stuff is also a way of it feels to me like a cousin of this thing I've heard a lot. At one point, when I was thinking about what I was going to call the Rip Current at my podcast, I was going to call it NPC, non-player character, which is this term in Silicon Valley for people who don't count. That people will say, like, inside a company there are agents.
Is, just to be clear, this is Jacob's very popular podcast, The Rip Current. Certainly worth subscribing for all keen on.
I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. And so, I was going to call it NPC because I had heard over and over again that term used, non-player character, to basically describe the worldview of a lot of people at the tops of these companies who really consider themselves to be the kind of main characters of the plot, and everybody else is kind of a background actor, an NPC. And so for me, there's something about those leaders talking about the dangers of what they have created that feels to me more akin to, you should let us think about this stuff, and don't worry about how the NPCs feel about it. That's part of how I
mean, you, and of course, I'm sure you've seen the movie Being John Malkovich, where we voyaged into the mind, the body of Malkovich. If we could voyage into Sam Altman body and brain, what would we find? Would we find that there are two sides to Sam and they're continually struggling with one another? Or would we find a more Machiavellian architecture where he knows exactly what he's saying in order to satisfy one constituency or another?
I don't want to be mealy-mouthed about it, but I've had one conversation with Sam Altman. I've read a huge amount about it, and I've listened to a huge amount of his public.
I mean, I don't want to personalize it with Altman himself, but
you
talked
the
about these
perspective.
prominent tech people who are dominating the discourse and driving us forward, whether it's Sam or Musk or one of the others, or even the guys at Anthropic. How do they talk to themselves about it?
I do think that they consider, you undoubtedly know the former blogger and now sort of political, the neo-reactionary, whatever it is, Curtis Yarvin. Right?
Yeah,
that guy. Yeah. So his shtick about,
and isn't he over in the East Bay too?
Yeah, I've never met him, but he's supposedly in these parts as well. He, his for anybody who doesn't know, he sort of espouses this idea that there should be this kind of intellectual monarchy that runs things, and he has a huge number of fans in the upper strata of that world. The Mark Andreessens and the Peter Thiels and these guys are in theory kind of into his ideas, and I think that there is a vein of that runs through a lot of these people. That is, there are very, very smart people whose ideas should be allowed to drive the bus, and we may not know exactly where the bus is going, but we should be allowed to experiment live with this stuff, and because clearly our great ideas are going to get refined over time and go further. I also think a lot of these people, because they came up in software, subscribe to the idea that over time, scale solves your problems, right? The thing in software is the more people you put this thing out to, the more you're going to find the glitches and work them out. And those edge cases will become a smaller and smaller percentage of the whole. And over time, it'll get better and better and better until you're fine. But I think of AI as much more as like hardware, where the problems get compounded by scale over time. And I worry about that. So I think these guys think, well, there's going to be a huge amount of damage done, certainly in the short term, to our conventional economic systems and the way that labor works and capital works and blah, 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 blah. But over the long term, as we scale this thing, those edge cases are going to get worked out and we're going to get to a better place. So I think, I don't think anybody, I think there are very few people in this world who get up in the morning to do damage, to consciously do damage to people. But there, I think, are many, many ways to convince yourself that the damage you're doing is in the service of a future that is better than today. And that's what I think most of these people are doing.
I can think of one or two people getting up with that on their mind, but that's another conversation. You mentioned Curtis Yarvin. I wonder who seems to argue that democracy is not an ideal system, that we as human beings, he seems to think of us as systems or programming systems. We're better suited to monarchies or aristocracies. I wonder whether, though, your thesis in the Loop is similar in the sense that you think of us, or your presentation of humanity in the Loop is as a kind of system, if not a computer, that we do have what you call kind of operating systems.
Yep.
Have you rethought or refined or questioned your definition of what humans are since the Loop?
I will, no, I don't think I have, but the way that I think you're right, that like, if I sat down with Curtis Yarvin, I bet we would agree that human beings are very much that way, that we are, very easily manipulated and led by a monarch and swayed by people and so forth. I believe that we would
And
agree.
He, of course,
on
celebrates that, and you don't.
That's the thing. I think that he believes that the power structure that should be built should, as a result, do away with having to, with the messiness of having to herd all these cats. My feeling is the most beautiful things about being human and about civilized society is the ways in which we have herded cats. And, one of the big argument that I keep making in this book, and let me tell you right now, it's hard to get paid making this argument these days, is we need to keep some inefficiency. We got to hang on to some friction. One of the examples that comes up in the book is, I was talking to a federal judge who described how you could make entering a guilty plea or not guilty plea vastly easier. You could make it a swipe right, swipe left kind of thing, but they intentionally make it hard because that bureaucratic process you got to go through, where you show up in person and you have to have they really want you to have a lawyer present, and all those things, is designed to keep you thinking about the decision you're making, because you never get to make that decision again, and it's going to change your life forever. So they want you to keep it going. And he refers to that as weak perfection, that we need some weak perfection in order to keep going. And my worry is, I gave a presentation once to a bunch of people, Silicon Valley crowd, about in the early days of the social credit system in China, this system that keeps you from speaking loudly on the quiet car, because if you are reported by somebody else and you're found, for instance, to be friends with bad people on social media or anything else, it reflects poorly on your credit score. Both, you can go to jail, but you can also not get a loan if you need to buy an apartment. So I was describing that system to people at this crowd, and half of them thought that was a great idea and thought we should absolutely implement that here. And the other half gasped the way I do when I hear about that as a sort of authoritarian surveillance and control system. And so I just think we can agree that human beings are deeply predictable, deeply frail, deeply vulnerable to this stuff. But are we going to make money off that? Or are we going to actually step back and say, who do we want to be? What society do we want to live in?
Although, I take your point, but on the other hand,
yeah.
would also suggest that anyone who makes expensive clothes or art or cars, I mean, we're all weak, Jacob.
Sure.
Religious and pre-religious wise people made that point throughout our history as a species. So you're suggesting you shouldn't be allowed to manufacture a Porsche or sell an expensive dress because you're appealing to us, to our narcissism or our weakness of some sort or other? Or an expensive meal. You're over in Oakland.
Yeah,
there are lots
sure.
of restaurants which charge $500 for a meal, which is absurd, but somehow that intrigues and attracts us.
I think the distinction I draw between that and what I'm seeing foisted on us in terms of AI products is something about how powerfully these AI products are simulating and playing on some really fundamental human emotions. And one of them, for instance, is this huge fly-by-night industry that has emerged around making these AI girlfriends. This always on, very sexualized chat bot, and in some cases video kind of response system that stands in for your companionship. And I've talked to people who use AI as a companion, as a friend, as a sort of personal cheerleader. But there are people who are truly like spending all of their romantic energies on these things. And to my mind, there's a difference in kind between, a temptation that is brought to you via marketing, and that you might go into a little credit card debt on, and that is bad for you in these general ways, like a Porsche or something that you can't afford. There's a difference for me between that and something that is playing on the most basic systems in your brain, impersonating an irresistible emotional piece of circuitry and ensnaring you in that kind of way, especially one that starts out, there's a natural barrier in that a lot of people can't afford a Porsche. That is not going to be true with these systems, especially as people figure out revenue streams that are going to make it possible for you to, get ensnared by this thing and not have to spend any money to do it. So there's no weak perfection in that process. Whereas in something like marketing a Porsche, I think there is some.
Yeah, I think there's more I think can talk about AI. There's a biblical quality. Of course, most of us can't afford expensive girlfriends or boyfriends, but maybe that's what ChatGPT does. Finally, Jacob, as I said, you're the host of an excellent new podcast. Well, not so new, The Rip Current. Your last one was on Charlie Kirk. That has become an obsession one way or the other. Media freedom of expression, obviously violence in politics, and the future of American democracy. You're backed in part by the Omidyar Network, which is a progressive network. We hear less about it these days, but they're still around. What do you make of America's current political moment and the threats to democracy? Certain president, whose name we won't mention, and this existential or maybe existential threat of AI. Are they connected, or are they happening in parallel, these two crises?
Well, I think that the forces that inspired me to write the book originally had to do with the degree to which, either companies or political actors were learning the kind of operating system that you mentioned, learning the human circuitry that helps guide our decision making, and the degree to which somebody like the president in his first campaign, learned to activate a lot of that stuff in ways that people hadn't really seen before. And so I think that one of the difficulties that we face right now is that at the very moment that we're going to need to take a principled stand, I think, about what we should be doing next, the problem is these systems, these AI systems, like social media before them, are so useful to people in power to maintain and expand power that there's very little, there's very little desire politically, I think, to rein that stuff in. And I think as a result, we're going to enter a world, I think we're almost there, where you're going to have you're not going to be able to trust your own eyes. Right now, we're still in a fairly primitive, video and photo generation moment where you can look at a AI generated, portrait of the president with a bunch of imaginary black supporters and look at it and be like, oh, this is, that shirt doesn't make any sense, or what's written on that hat there. There's stuff that you can tell is fake. That's not going to be true in a couple of quarters. And that worries me a huge amount. And I think that we're increasingly going to be in a place where we just can't agree on, we're already there in a sense, but I think the filter bubble problem is going to become exponentially worse once we're in a world where you come home each evening and say, computer, tonight I'd like to, learn some, get maybe some news, but make it happy news tonight, or, computer, I'd like a Viking movie starring Tom Hanks. Make that for me. The custom, self-created world of content that we're all going to be living in a few years' time has me very worried about our ability to come together over some shared ideas and some ideological differences and sort them out in the way we're supposed to.
In other words, a personalized ontology. We will choose what we see in the entire world around us. It is rather chilling, particularly, I think, in the context. I began this show talking about Maria Ressa, her speech earlier this week at the UN, where organizations, political organizations, are increasingly weak. So lots of reasons not to be cheerful, but we have Jacob Ward around, the author of The Loop. I know he's working on an important new book. We'll get you back, Jacob, on the show. Certainly won't be another 5 years. Real honor to have you. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, keep thinking, keep resisting. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Appreciate your time.